Welcome to Draw Process. I'm Ike. I'm drawing another page of my comic today. I'll share my techniques, thoughts, and process. It's page 31 of episode 2 of First Sun and Sword. And like I mentioned last week, my ink was drying out, and this was the page when I was figuring out and trying to diagnose my issue. The ink was too thick, so it was not running down the nib, down the fountain pen, that little channel towards the end where the ink needs to kind of be dropped out onto the page, for lack of a better term. And so I struggled with it on this page. It made it take longer. Last week's page took about 3 hours to draw, and this one, I'm not sure, but it was definitely longer. It had resulted in messier inks, a lot more lines, and let's see. I usually do. I typically in the past have done a solid edge to my shadows, a line that would follow the edge of shadows, and then I would fill it in solid black. And then sometimes I move towards a solid line on that edge where it transitions from like the shadow to light. But with lines within it, in like parallel lines or zigzags or something. And sometimes I will do kind of a tapered edge, sawtooth kind of edge to a line, a sort of hatching. You could call it, it's kind of like a cross hatching, but it's a zigzag line that would transition from light to dark is what it would imply. And so I've done more of that in the past. But in this one, I started doing even more just straight lines to make things darker. Even there's actually one point where I covered a building in diagonal lines, which makes it seem darker. And then of course the color will come in and darken things up or brighten things accordingly. But trying some new things that are maybe more reminiscent of manga than American comics, but I've been really liking it. I like how dynamic it feels and kind of loose. It's easier to draw. The pencils don't have to be as solid before I can start inking because the inking itself is drawing. And so I did that more on this than I have in the past. And sometimes I hit those moments you have where you realize you're on the edge of something new, which is the best place to be. It's a little uncomfortable, but it's so fun. And I feel like I hit one of those points on this page, which always pushes me forward. I'm motivated to keep going. I'm looking forward to drawing the next page. Sometimes it gets less exciting, I'm more bored with it or something, less motivated, but it comes back to me after moments like this. And so you'll get to see that as I get into the inking on this page. What I'm sketching out here on this big panel is a giant top-down kind of view, a high angle view of I guess it's a high camera looking down. So I guess that's a low angle technically. The terminology always escapes me, but of the city, and at the bottom is a hill. So the foreground element of the hill that I'm going to put sun and the cart on, and then the city stretching out with the vanishing point off camera, out of the shot, because the camera's so high up. And that sort of shot in the past would have been much more intimidating when I had a much more rigid style, more strict blocks of black and less lines on the page, and thicker lines. I used to even do a thicker line. And a deader line. So like dead meaning even thickness at all times, using a pen. And in the past, it would have taken longer to lay that out and to draw it, and to be able to imply buildings in the distance if you're trying to do really solid lines. I didn't do that this time. it's I'm moving towards that looser style, using the nib, which gives me varying line thickness, and I can quickly sketch in a cityscape with very little pencils put down first. So, and I feel like it looks consistent. It flows even if it is kind of messy. And so what we have here is on the last page, a man blew a horn to warn the palace, to warn the guards, and Kurok the man-eater, that they had found son and sword. And so we have Farah, who was on her way, either, we don't know for sure, but probably on her way to the what do you call them? The docks, to the market, the black market, to purchase some medicine for sword. And she hears it, and she's, shocked, and she's going to have to run to their aid. And what we have in these 3 panels is one moment in time. So I don't often do it. Again, I usually go with a simpler panel layouts and designs. But these panels, they have that diagonal border between them instead of vertical. And that gives it this kind of sense of it being cut in. So these 3 panels all share one wide rectangle, and there's a diagonal cut in between them. And so what I'm implying there, something I'm considering and how it feels to me, is that it implies that this is all happening at the exact same moment. Each person's reaction. So her, Kurok the man-eater, and then I don't know what you want to call them, the royal guard running. And so these men are going to look different than the earlier men. The other earlier men look like scoundrels that were hired to just go door to door looking for them. And then these are trained, special soldiers. A spear with a small shield. I could have gone with the same kind of men, but I wanted to introduce more variety and a different sort of risk for our characters to be up against trained soldiers. In First Son and Sword, issue 1, they were in Crocodile City, and those men they had matching uniforms, but they were kind of like a gang. They just had a different feel than what you would imagine with these. These guys almost look like Spartans or something. So you're going to have a different sense, and they're going to fight in a different manner than what felt like mercenaries or something with that last one. Very rough, lighter pencils underneath this, but you'll see that it's just enough shapes laid down that I can start to free hand draw on top of it. This is a nice large panel, a good establishing shot. Would give us more of a sense of what the city looks like. I'm tricking or cheating the perspective and everything like that, because I want them to be on a hill on the foreground and us to look over the hill, but I also want us to be able to see the city going off in the distance, which is actually even more difficult in real life, challenging to capture this shot because they're going somewhat downhill towards the coast too. So it's hard to show the buildings going up in the distance when they're on a hill going down. But it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. I'm just going with what looks believable and feels good. But yeah, as you can see, the buildings, the road they're on there must not be a building to their right, as you'll see. Because the road looks a little too offset, but it looks nice in the shot. It looks believable. It's enough of something I can cheat. And I'm not going to show this exact location again so that they won't be able to see how off it is, I guess you could say. Okay. What I first penciled there was the foreground element. The road that they're on, the cart going over that hill, and sword in it, and sun pushing it. And then I'm just making up buildings to throw in the background. Especially when it comes time to ink, I'm going to be thinking about how to separate that foreground from the background with the inking. And then also with the colors, I separate the fore and background there. Let's see, a few thoughts today. Maybe a bit about when things feel natural to people or not. And one element of that is the uncanny valley. You may have heard of this term before. But the idea that the closer something gets to looking like a real person, whether that's a robot that gets more human-like, or an animation where it starts to look more and more realistic. The more realistic it gets, the more you can get an unsettling feeling. So if a character approximates reality, or the art style approximates reality too closely, the psychosocial mind rejects it, you could say, has a defense up against emotionally connecting with it. So the more I don't use reference, the more I draw from an authentic drawing voice, my own kind of vision, the further I'm going to be from anything that feels too real, obviously. But I wanted to expand on that idea because I think this could be stretched in more context. For example, I've noticed not only the art style, but the style of the panels, of what is shown in them, can be something that can feel off when it's too close to reality. So what I'm thinking there is, if when I see comics where the panels accurately depict, let's say, one character punching another, and it's very accurate, and it's very much at the moment of contact, let's say, it doesn't feel like a punch. The more realistic that looks, the less dynamic it looks, the less it feels like someone getting hit, and might even look awkward. And you could even see that if you take movies with moving images, and you pause them, like the film with movement in the action, it might feel very dynamic, feel very good. But if you pause that and then you were to just say, okay, I'm going to pause that, and there we go, these two guys are fighting, I'll just pause it and capture that on the panel. They may be on an awkward pose. It may not be very, a good composition, good dynamics. But they can look kind of static. I think this also applies when there's something getting too accurate with the flow of what occurs moment to moment, panel by panel. So if I show someone preparing to punch, fist leaning back, getting ready to punch, and then the punch, and then the reaction, if you break it down, each moment, each millisecond of that action, the more you break it down, the more it will pull the reader out of the story. It's kind of like the uncanny valley there. It's getting too too much information, too specific, moment by moment. That's how the images flow to the person that gets too close to how they flow in real life and starts to feel less real. They flow less by doing that. So there's kind of a sweet spot there too. It's not like you don't want to show, any before and after of actions, but there's a way to choose, like how many shots do I need to show this action and for it to feel like it connects with the reader, but is not too many. Do I really need before, middle, and after, or can I skip out the middle panel? And should each panel be the same exact camera angle with the same action playing out? Probably not, because again, that's getting too concrete. And that starts to feel off. So we want the reader to construct the story in their mind. It's not an animation or a film. And we can't construct it all for them on the page, or it feels off. It pulls them out of the story. I prefer to refer to it that way than, I've heard people say, adding more panels will tend to slow down time, the sense of time in the story. I'm not so sure about that, because I've always been skeptical of judging people's sense of time and how time passes when they read a story, or read a comic. I think that's pretty subjective, but I do know the feeling when I'm reading a comic of getting pulled out of the story, pulled out of the action, and too many images. You could say it breaks down time, but for me, it bogs down my connection with constructing the story. Also, there's a certain amount of continuity that you want to provide, but not too much. And, for a beginner, you might tell them, hey, make sure you have some continuity. So like if a character is holding something out in front of them in one panel, in the panel before, you might show they're reaching in their pocket. Like maybe they're the script, the story, you might need them to simply walk in the room and talk while they're talking to someone. But in that previous panel, you might show their hand in their pocket, like they're pulling something out. And then in the next panel, you see the hand with something in it. And even in, with that, is if it's a close up on the hand, you might make sure it's got the same bracelet that the person was wearing in the last one, or the same, sleeve. How many, you're trying to send cues to the reader that help them track the movement of objects through space, and the important elements that as they connect panel to panel. But if you do too much of that, then you're not specific with your story. It's off-putting in its own way. It's uncanny valley of its own kind, because you're not being selective about what you're showing. You're showing too much. But I've read comics where they don't show enough of that. There's not, if someone's in a room and there's a chair in the room and we see it in one panel, and somehow they're standing somewhere else and there's no indication of the chair, there's no indication of the windows that we just saw. Like maybe it is just the other side of the room that you're showing as the person moved. But if there's no context clues of the connection of this space to that, or from one room to the next, if someone's in one room and then they're going to be in the next, have a doorway that's open that shows into the next space in the prior panel. This kind of thing creates a sense of continuity. And if people don't do enough of that in their comics, it also pulls you out of the story. I guess if we're on the topic here uncanny valley and awkward things. Some of these are turning out, as I see, some of these things I've mentioned are more like a spectrum. You don't want to go too far one way or the other. But we could say, perhaps we could say the depiction of perspective in three-dimensional space is another one. I've seen comics where the characters are, they're placed on a background that seems to simply be props. Their feet aren't really on the ground in perspective with the room they're in. It's, the background elements are props in a sense that are thrown in. But if you do too much of that, then that's going to pull the reader out too. It can even make me feel kind of seasick. I don't know if other people get that sensation or if it's just me, but it can make me feel like queasy if I'm going through a story where I can't track the movement of the characters and they don't seem to be in physical space, even though physical space is there, like the things are depicted. At the same time, if you are too rigid with depicting physical space accurately, that can also be a little weird to see. Everything is too snapped to a grid. And boring results from that too, because you're not able to be as selective, and you're not, again, with being selective, showing them what you want them to see. You're not as selective because, if you're going to be totally accurate and you show the person there, and then you're using grids or you're using 3D models that you're putting in, working digitally. And you start to have less of a direct hand on the construction of the space, the composition, and the elements that you're going to show. So if you've constructed a 3D space and there's a picture on the wall, and then you position your camera and you're like, okay, the picture we see half the picture in the background. Well, that might look weird. Or if it's right behind someone's head, well, now I've got to put that there and it's behind their head, and yet it's awkwardly behind their head in the next panel. Or all kinds of things, like if you can't see two figures, if one looks way larger than the other because of the perspective, those things are like, I see that one really often, where the figures, by rigidly sticking to this, the figures seem separated by so much space, depending on the setup. But again, even just the fact that it appears snapped to such a rigid grid is uncanny valley feeling. It's off-putting. Now, in real life, everything kind of is. Everything is pretty solid appearing to us. But that's real life. It's the same thing with the uncanny valley about animation, Yes, in real life, things look really realistic, but the closer you get to being realistic in drawings and animations around, the more weird it feels. Even in filmmaking, they're not trying to show you what things really looked like there in person. They're trying to, make it cinema, if they're doing their job. This is adjusting light and shadow and color and composition and framing of things to tell the story, not just to be, accurate. And that gets into something I've talked about before with like camera lenses in the abstract, of course. This is comics, but you will see in movies or in a lot of things these days, there's a lot more wide angle lenses like GoPros, right? The wide angle lens that's extremely wide, and it distorts the distance between things, the size of things in comparison. Back in the day, if your reference was old cinema where the camera's very distant and things are almost flattened by this long, this narrow lens, this, long, what do you call it? Anyways, it's a long focal length. Then if you were using that for visual reference while you drew your comic, and then you look at those comics that those people drew using that reference, and I've actually seen examples of this, the comics continue that similar flat look. The people in the foreground and background are almost the same size, and they're all sitting at a table. But if the camera was closer to them, or it's a wide angle lens, that one guy's going to be much larger than the other guy. It might even beyond what the human eye would have seen, even distorted from that. But these days we're getting more comfortable with these other, lenses, these other looks of things that are even outside of, what the human eye would normally see. And I think that's cool because that's something I wanted to mention here is when people are too rigidly sticking to the perspective, to the grid, then they're also tending to be bad cinematographers, let's say. If you're constructing a space three-dimensionally in an app, and then you're moving your models around, and then you position the camera, you're probably not going to set up a great shot. And you're not going to adjust the field of view, the lens, based on what you want, a more subjective or objective feeling. So it's all storytelling, right? I mean, it's all telling a story, communicating something. The goal is not to provide the most information or the most accurate information. And that's why I love comics. Like, I love how subjective it is that I get to be creative with it and express myself. Yeah. And like I always say, that's the kind of comics I like when I look at things I like. I guess I could expand this to color. I like it when comics are more unique in their color choices and in how they represent things with the color. There's certain doing. I will say there's just kind of a standard look to how comics are colored and the way they're done. And some of that is color palettes that tend to be reused, the use of warm and cool colors, of brushes or textures, or certain, gradients, which luckily we've moved away a lot from a lot of the gradients of early digital coloring. But there's still a look that's pretty common with coloring. And I actually prefer more abstract coloring that is doing its own thing, different than the line art. I mean, I don't think of my coloring as trying to match the line art in the sense of the lighting sources of the line art. Even that, it doesn't have to match exactly. And the style of the lines in the line art do not have to be matched in the color. The color is just like everything I just said about the line art. It applies to the color too. And so it's its own storytelling form, it needs to do its own thing and not just try to do what the line artist did, even if you're the same person. And same thing with the uncanny valley point. The more you try to reflect the actual color of things, or not only the color they are in the real world, but how lighting and color would look to the human eye in that exact environment. If you're trying to represent it accurately, it's going to look worse. Because you need to design it, compose it more, like communicate. Again, you are telling the story through what you show, even with what colors you select. And if you don't do that, it doesn't matter how accurate it is, it's not going to feel right to people. And I'm not the best at coloring. It's something I keep getting a little better at as I go. And every time I color something new, it's I keep changing palettes and approaches, even to the coloring. So sometimes I get better at it as I go into a book. I'm starting to like the colors more at this point in the book, 31 pages in, and I might go back and adjust them a bit in the earlier pages. I have started taking a little bit of extra time to add lighting and shadow as a separate layer, that just to punch things up and help things pop off the background, like your figures. But I didn't used to do that. I used to try to use only flat color to separate things most of the time. Not anymore. Yeah. And I don't make my shadows match precisely where the shadows were placed with the inks. Again, like I was saying, having it do its own thing. All right, so now I'm coming in with the brush, the Pentel Pocket brush, and not everywhere, but I'm not trying to perfectly fill in all of the black areas, but I am adding some in some places. You could think of it like maybe like a golden ratio again, like the amount of black in a panel being a certain balanced amount, 70-30, you could say, 30 black or 70 black. And then it's the same here when I'm adding the like more full blacks. I'm doing it to maybe 30 to 70% of the lines that I placed. But it obviously punches things up a bit. It adds more depth. And here I am doing these energy lines you might see in manga. I never thought I would do that, and here I am doing it, and I like it. So whatever. That's what I'll be doing now, I guess. At least it isn't a dynamic moment, quite dynamic moment. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, there's so much to the storytelling and all the decisions to make, like where to place word balloons, how large to make them, how often to use them, and sound effects, like how often are these things needed, and at what point are they hindering the reader's immersion into the story. That here's a page with no word balloons, and I think it's better for it. In this page, the composition here, I like the bottom two panels is forming a V, like Kurok, the man-eater, he's coming diagonally from top to bottom, and then she's on the opposite diagonal, like a mirror image of his running is her running. So there's a nice balance to this page, and with some diagonals mixed in, some interest. I let my inks just bleed past the panel borders, but that's really easy to clean up in the digital Clip Studio. So there is the finished page. Thanks for tuning in again this week, and I am going to keep going. I'll do my best to be the practice of my art and encourage others to do the same. And I encourage you to do the same.